some introduction, and then we'll get started with our conversation here. My name is Jack Barlow. I teach politics at Juniata College in Pennsylvania, and you'll come out and look at Juniata College sometime.
My name is Joe Stewart. I teach at Clemson University in South Carolina. We got a lot of students in New York to visit in the spring, and the snow is a bit deeper in New York than it is in South Carolina.
Yes.
I'm Tim Moore from the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin. It's great to be here.
And we're glad to welcome you. Would you introduce yourselves, please, and your teacher as well?
Yes. Good morning, Your Honors. Nice to meet you. My name is Diana Arroyo.
Good afternoon. My name is Jason Perez.
Good afternoon. My name is Leonora Koshi.
Good afternoon. My name is Afaza Pasha, and I would like to take a brief moment to introduce our principal, Ms. Cohen, and our coaches, Ms. Rudder, Ms. Kovat, and Ms. Azoff.
Oh, great! Sounds like you're well coached. Glad that you're here. Where in New York are you from?
We're from Brooklyn.
Brooklyn. Okay, I like Brooklyn. Okay, so as foreshadowed, this is Unit 2, and the question for today probably will also come as no surprise to you. It's question 1. I will read it, and we will get started. The states sent delegates to the Philadelphia Convention to join with other states, quote, in devising and discussing all such alterations and further provisions as may be necessary to render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of the Union. To what extent, if any, did the delegates follow their instructions? What experiences of state governments under their new constitutions after independence might have influenced the creation of the Constitution? Do the decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court function as a continuing constitutional convention? Why or why not? You may begin.
Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government held no direct power to unite the nation. The Founding Fathers rebelled against a tyrannical monarchy. The product of this rebellion was a ratification of the Articles of Confederation. The primary role of this Philadelphia Convention was to address the exigencies of the Union under the Articles and to create a balance of power between federal and state governments. Thomas Jefferson said, "I had rather ask an enlargement of power from the nation where it is found necessary than to assume it by a construction which would make our powers boundless." Although Thomas Jefferson was not present at the Philadelphia Convention, his perspective captures that of the Founding Fathers to revise and implement a more powerful and useful constitution. Under the Articles, it soon became clear there was a weak national government which was significantly overshadowed by 13 sovereign states. State governments were too powerful and the federal government too weak, but the constitutions from the individual states created a precedent which in many ways would become the model for the federal system of government under the new Constitution.
The Massachusetts and Virginia state constitutions created a bicameral Congress through their constitutions and established an executive branch and an independent judiciary. The Virginia Constitution said, quote, "The legislative body shall be made up of 2 distinct branches, who together shall be a complete legislature," end quote. There was a clear separation of powers and a system of checks and balances in place, a system that would be used in the federal Constitution. The state constitutions accounted for the rights which would ultimately be included in the National Bill of Rights. 3 common rights adopted in the Bill of Rights from the state constitutions are free exercise of religion, local impartial jury, and jury trial. To further ensure that the Constitution was a living document, the Supreme Court acts as a continuing constitutional convention.
The Philadelphia Convention was a necessary step in addressing problems under the Articles of Confederation and creating something new and entirely unprecedented. From the Constitution's inception, the Supreme Court was the most powerful court in the country, but no power was given to assess the constitutionality of laws until Marbury v. Madison. This case created a lasting impact that would allow the Supreme Court to evaluate the constitutionality of different laws in the process, which is known as judicial review, and allows for interpretation. The decision of Marbury v. Madison gave rise to 2 theories of interpretation: judicial activism and judicial restraint. For example, the Constitution never explicitly states standards for marriage. States determine their own marriage requirements in their jurisdiction. In Virginia, interracial marriage was illegal under the state's anti-miscegenation law. It was not until Loving v. Virginia that the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, said that Virginia's anti-miscegenation law violates the equal protection and due process clauses of the 14th Amendment.
This was viewed as an activist ruling of the Constitution as it was not originally protected. The ruling was made by the Warren Court, which pioneered the way for expanded civil rights and effectively ended racial segregation in U.S. public schools, along with the expansion of the constitutional rights of defendants, insurance of equal representation in state legislators, outlawed state-sponsored prayers in public schools, and paved the way for the legalization of abortion. This is all the result of the loose interpretation of the Constitution that allowed for the evolution of who is protected. In addition, Obergefell v. Hodges, along with Loving v. Virginia, expanded upon the scope of marriage in the fact that same-sex marriage is constitutional. These two historic rulings demonstrate judicial activism at work. Examples of judicial restraint are Plessy v. Ferguson and Dred Scott v. Sanford. These two decisions of how the Supreme Court should rule function as a constitutional convention as they adapt to the changing values and interpret the Constitution as they see fit in today's society. As stated by Charles Evan Hughes, we are under a constitution, but the Constitution is what the judges say it is, and the judiciary is the safeguard of our property and our liberty and our property under the Constitution.
Thank you. Well, I think it's appropriate you ended with a quotation from a New Yorker. That's good. So in the congressional resolution approving the Constitutional Convention was a little bit different from the one that's quoted in the question. So talk to me a little bit. If there are conflicting instructions, how do the delegates choose which one to follow?
Wait.
Am I being clear? So how do the delegates decide whether they're going, how the Constitutional Convention delegates decide whether they're going to follow the instructions of Congress, right, which says make it adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union, or the Virginia authorization, which is the one that's quoted? Does that only bind the delegates from Virginia?
I'd like to start off. The delegates chose to, based off of the Virginia plan, which would include a bicameral Congress, and it's all part of the Great Compromise, which was used to accommodate for both sides of the aisle, for both Federalists and Anti-Federalists. For the Anti-Federalists wanted strong sovereign states and a weaker central government, but the Federalists advocated for a stronger central government because of the Articles of Confederation and how George Washington referred to it as a rope of sand. So the Great Compromise was supposed to accommodate for both groups at the convention.
Yeah, and to add on to my colleague, the Virginia plan was they proposed a strong national government, and this strong national government would have the power to enforce laws and collect taxes, and each citizen would be governed by two governments, the state and the national government, and then both governments would get their authority from the people themselves. And all the governments would be comprised of three branches: the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branch.
Thank you.
Do you think, what were some of the Anti-Federalist criticisms of the convention itself?
The Anti-Federalists, they wanted a stronger states to be in charge and for a looser central government, but the Federalists wanted a stronger central government. So the Anti-Federalists themselves, they thought the Constitution did not protect individuals' rights enough, and their main argument at the convention was to include a Bill of Rights, which we know as the first 10 amendments. And the 10th Amendment, which is probably the most important to them, was all rights not delegated to the federal government was reserved for the states. And that was very important for the states in the Anti-Federalists argument during this time.
Correct. But I'm asking about their criticism of the convention itself, separate and different from the Constitution. What do you think of the secrecy rule at Philadelphia?
The secrecy rule was a very powerful rule that was needed because the country's already on its last stand with because the Articles of Confederation was too weak, and the secrecy rules was needed to make sure any confidential information did not get out, which would supposedly hurt them in the future. So the secrecy rule was necessary to the preservation of the Union.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about ratification. Was ratification a foregone conclusion? Were we going to get this Constitution once the people in Philadelphia had produced it?
Can you repeat that, please?
Sure. I'm wondering about the people go to Philadelphia and they produce this new document, but they still have to get it ratified. We look back on it and say, well, of course we're going to happen, but was there conflict about that? Can you tell me anything about that ratification process?
Yes, there was definitely conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and along with all this conflict, we had the publication of Federalist Papers and Anti-Federalist Papers. So for one of the strongest arguments for the Federalist side was Federalist 51, the separation of powers, that no one branch shall have this conglomerate of power, which could lead to a tyrannical ruling, which they just escaped from. And the Anti-Federalists, they wanted the Bill of Rights, which would secure individual liberties within the first 10 amendments. So there was definitely arguments from both sides, and both sides arguing that it should be passed or it shouldn't be passed.
Go ahead, Diana.
Yes, I would like to agree with my colleague. I think the ratification was a very important step in the preservation of our country. It definitely showed us that sometimes there are agreeing and disagreeing with people of our nation, especially in the states. But I think that with the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, it really shows us that our nation as a whole can really come to a compromise and come to an understanding as to what's for the better of the nation as a whole.
How about your state, New York? How did it work out in New York?
During its ratification?
Yeah.
New York was, I see my time is up. Can I finish my thought?
Please do.
You can finish. Yeah, finish.
During the research process, we realized that New York actually had a freedom of religion and no religious requirement to run for public office under the state constitution during the Articles of Confederation. And we found that that's in the Constitution now, that we see that there's no religious requirements at all. And we see how the state constitutions, the national constitution took inspiration from the state constitutions. And New York is a perfect example of that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's partly because Gouverneur Morris, who wrote the New York Constitution, was the drafter of the Philadelphia Constitution. He slipped it in at the last minute. So yeah, being in the right place at the right time is important.